top 5 literary garbage cans. Mr. Rochester is up there with Victor Frankenstein for me, I think. So. Hey guys, it's Jackie. Welcome back to my channel. So, I'm feeling really Christmassy, but I'm not really in the Christmas reading mood quite yet. So I thought I would do something kind of more general for all of you guys. So I thought for today's video I would do a if you like this, you will like this video. And I thought that I would do it as a kind of if you like this book, you will like this classic, just to kind of put a little bit of a spin on it. This is something I really like to do in a lot of the classes I teach. I really enjoy pairing up classic texts, so classic novels, with things that are more modern, more contemporary, more, published within the last 30 years or so. And I do that for a few reasons, because I have a couple clarifications with this video before I really kind of jump into the book recommendations, which is that, this isn't really me being like, if you like this YA novel, you'll like this real book, because I really despise that. I really hate the very snotty designations that are made between classic literature, the canon, and everything that isn't the canon. I think that that is a completely artificial construction. I, as an instructor and an academic, hate it. I'm very suspicious of the canon. I think it needs to be done away with, which academia thankfully has really moved away from that kind of thinking, because I find that that kind of thinking really limits the ways that we understand what constitutes literature. So this is not me recommending classics instead of something. This is more for if you're interested in getting into the classics for whatever edifying reasons. Classic literature has its downsides. It has its plus sides. It's really what you make of it, and what value it has should come from something, I think, internally motivated, and not just that I'm reading the classics because I think I'm supposed to. I think that is a horrible way to get into a reading slump. And again, I think can really limit or prescribe your way of thinking about literature, about reading, and what has literary merit, which is incidentally also an artificial construction, right? So I'm gonna cut the rambling, go ahead and get started with my recommendations for things that I think you may like. Alright, so my first recommendation is that if you like Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell, you might like Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. And you might like them because both of these are the story of young women who become fanishly obsessed with their literature of choice to the degree that it starts to create roadblocks for them in, going out into the world and seeing what else the world has to offer, she said, with her books clutched in her hands. I'm a fandom baby, so both of these are very interesting to me. If you're interested in the history of fandom, I think Northanger Abbey is really, really fascinating. If you're not familiar with Northanger Abbey, this is one of Austen's later novels. It was published in 1818. I think it was written maybe a little bit earlier than that. It is a satire, which, Jane Austen is always funny. Her novels are always satirical, but this one is flagrantly a satire and is bitingly funny. She is coming so hard for the Gothic romantic novel in this book. Northanger Abbey is the story of Catherine Morland, who is this 18-year-old girl. She loves Gothic novels, and her love of these novels makes her begin to interpret situations around her a certain way and project melodrama onto those situations. So this is a really funny read. It's an interesting read. Again, I say it's interesting in the history of fandom studies because usually when we talk about fandom studies, we talk about Sherlock Holmes and how Sherlock Holmes is the first modern fandom in the way that we understand it, which is true. It's Sherlock Holmes and then Star Trek in the 60s, that these are really kind of the great granddaddies of fandom. And that's true, but there were fandoms as we would recognize them or understand them much earlier, including a kind of fanishness around the Gothic romantic novel in the late 18th and early 19th century. And the fanishness around the novel in this period is largely led by young women in their teens and 20s who are just really loving what it is the novel has to offer, especially the Gothic romance, which then, of course, means that all of the moral gatekeepers of the Regency era are insisting that, the novel is trash, it's bad for your mind, it's not real literature, it's stupid, because, if young women like it, it's poisonous garbage, it's not real lit. Again, like I said in my discretionary warning, our understanding of what is literary is in flux all the time and is socially shaped and motivated, so that's something to kind of keep in mind when we think about the canon. So anyway, if you like Fangirl, I think you'll like Northanger Abbey. Incidentally, Catherine and Kath, which I think is on purpose, if it is on purpose, please let me know and just be like, duh, of course, but I don't think I've ever read anything about Northanger Abbey being an influence on Fangirl, but I do think it's interesting that their names are Catherine and Kath. I think that that's kind of intriguing. My next recommendation is that if you like Vicious by V.E. Schwab, you will like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So, funnily enough, Vicious is one of my favorite contemporary novels, especially of the last couple of years, and Frankenstein is one of my all-time favorite classic novels. Such an important book in the history of the novel, in the history of science fiction, which, was perfected by a 19-year-old girl. Hi. And just such a fun read with such an interesting, very rich legacy. So I'm a huge fan of Frankenstein, even though I think Victor Frankenstein needs a good kick in the pants. I cannot stand Victor at all. Anyway, Victor and Vicious I like, actually. That's a Victor I really like. So both Vicious and Frankenstein are about overweening undergraduate students who decide to embark upon a very ambitious and maybe strange, morally dubious experiment with successful results. Successful in the short term. In the long term, not so much. So they're both dark academic texts. Again, they're both very much about, academics kind of overreaching themselves in really, really kind of morally questionable ways. Thinking that, that there somehow is the answer to eternal life. And kind of finding that answer and it being not really the answer you wanted. Exactly. Or that answer creating a lot of problems for you and maybe ultimately ruining your life. So both of these are really excellent. If you like Vicious, I think you will like Frankenstein. Frankenstein doesn't have, the really fun kind of friends to enemies dynamic that Vicious does. That's borrowing very heavily, right, from, things like Marvel Comics, which is why it's like Victor Vale and Eli Evers, right? That they're very much like Richard Reed and Victor Von Doom. That kind of relationship, friends to enemies to homoerotic nemesis. There's a lot of homoeroticism in Frankenstein, that's for sure. It's just a little bit different than it is in Vicious. Anyway, so I really like both of these. If you have not read Frankenstein, I would recommend it regardless. All right, my next recommendation is kind of a funny one. So if you like A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, I think you will like not Beauty and the Beast, which, is the text for this, but Jane Eyre, which also has a lot in common with Beauty and the Beast. So Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which was published in 1848, I think, 47, 48, is what a lot of fairy tale scholars have kind of called a bourgeois fairy tale. It's a novel that's very representative of something that was happening in the mid-Victorian period, like around the 1840s, 1850s, with a lot of realist authors like the Brontes and Charles Dickens, which was this kind of meshing of realism with fairy tale iconography. And so if you read Jane Eyre, you will see a lot of references to, among other things, Beauty and the Beast, Bluebeard, animal husband narratives more broadly, Cinderella. And so if you're interested in kind of novels that are remixing fairy tales in some ways, then this is an interesting one to give a try. Like A Court of Thorns and Roses, it also has let's just say, some problematic love interests, and I'll just leave it at that. But if you like this, I think you might be intrigued by Jane Eyre. Again, if you're not familiar with Jane Eyre, it follows the story of a young girl, Jane Eyre. Hi. Jane Eyre, an autobiography is the subtitle of this, who kind of makes her way from rags to riches. So it's kind of a Cinderella narrative, but inculcated into the middle of this Cinderella narrative is this bizarre Beauty and the Beast / Bluebeard narrative, in which she goes to work as a governess at Thornfield Hall, this very traditionally Gothic manor. This is a Gothic novel. It is like the Gothic novel. And falls in love with this very stern, distant, strange, broody master of the house, Mr. Rochester, who's hiding a big fat secret. And I won't spoil what it is, because I taught this book to my students and they didn't know what the spoiler was, and I envy them so much. If you like this, I think you should give this a try. It's very interesting. Again, very plucky, strong heroine, and the monster man she loves, who's not all that he seems. Let's just put it that way. All right, so this next recommendation is also fairy tale inspired. I just taught like all of these in spring, actually. So I have a few. If you liked Through the Woods by Emily Carroll, or Snow, Glass, and Apples by Neil Gaiman, or, you know, any kind of other dark, bloody, feminist retelling of fairy tales, Girls Made of Snow and Glass also comes to mind. So if you like that subgenre, if that's your thing, then I cannot recommend enough The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. Please read this. This is so interesting. If you love stuff like this, you should read this, really. So The Bloody Chamber is an anthology of a series of what are usually called feminist retellings of fairy tales, but Angela Carter makes it kind of clear that she doesn't feel like her versions of these fairy tales are retellings. You know, she talks about how what her project was to kind of draw out the latent content of fairy tales. So what, you know, themes of sex and violence and death and female empowerment were already in those stories, and recovering those themes rather than like, oh, I'm, you know, remixing them. That's not really her agenda here at all. So this was published in 1979 at the height of second wave feminism, and like I said, it's an anthology series. Each story is a different familiar fairy tale from the French and German traditions, and they're really wonderful. They're very surreal and dreamlike. The prose is very lush, so if you're really into kind of evocative, lush prose, you will enjoy this, I think. And they're really imaginative and smart retellings of a lot of these stories. Especially, my personal favorites are all of the Red Riding Hood ones. Things like Company of Wolves, which was actually made into a film in the 80s, which was like the most aggressively 80s fantasy film ever. I made my students watch it and they were just like, what is this? And I'm like, I told you, it's really weird. The 80s fantasy is bizarre, but hey. I really love all the Red Riding Hood narratives. I do really like the Beauty and the Beast story, The Tiger's Bride, which is really fun. And I really like, what is the full title of it? It's the Sleeping Beauty retelling, The Lady of the House of Love, which is this retelling of Sleeping Beauty in which she's a vampire, and it's really dark and gothic and scary. Just these are really excellent. All right, so my next recommendation I think is maybe a kind of more obvious one, and that is, if you like Wild Beauty by Anna Marie McLemore, you will like The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. So Isabel Allende is a known influence on McLemore's writing, a massive player in Latin American magical realism, which is kind of, the real powerhouse of magical realism. And House of the Spirits, like Wild Beauty, is a intergenerational magical realist text about a family, the Truebas, who have at the center of that family some very extraordinary women who have magical abilities. This is an intensely political novel, like Wild Beauty, which again has a kind of very understated socio-political bent, in as far as that, this is an aggressively queer novel, which is really, really fabulous. This is an aggressively political novel in the sense of explicitly political. It's about the many trials and tribulations and political rises and falls in Chile throughout the 20th century. So as we follow the Trueba family on this kind of strange magical realist intergenerational roller coaster, we're also following literally, the ride that the country itself is on, right? There's this kind of metaphysical relationship, right, between the family and the country, like in Wild Beauty, where there's literally a metaphysical connection between this family and the earth that they work. And this is also really, really obsessed with like earth and property and the land, and feeling some kind of spiritual connection to the land. This is a really dark read. It's again really lush. It's so beautiful. It's so immaculately crafted. I cannot recommend this novel enough if you love magical realism, especially if you love Anna Marie McLemore. Again, I think you will see the influence on McLemore's writing when you check out Isabel Allende. If this novel seems a little too daunting for you, even though it is my personal favorite of Allende's work, I also recommend the Eva Luna stories by Allende, which maybe are kind of more bite-sized and digestible if you want to kind of get started reading Latin American magical realism. Those are also really excellent. But if you wanna kick it off with a big doorstop of a novel, I highly recommend The House of the Spirits. It's one of my favorite books. All right, my next recommendation is kind of a strange one. This is, if you like The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzi Lee, which who on Booktube doesn't, I think, because it is baby, then you might like E.M. Forster's Maurice, or Morris, depending on how English you want to be about it. Like Gentleman's Guide, it's about a young, rich English aristocrat who's going on a journey of self-discovery and comes out the other side of that journey realizing that I am not a straight person, like, at all. And he falls in love with somebody in this novel who is just not appropriate for him to love, even laying aside the fact that it's another man, that this is really a person who you just cannot be with. There's just no way. Because even if you want to just very discreetly behind closed doors have, your homosexual liaison with another man of your class that will maybe politely look the other way. Homosexuality in this period is still illegal. This was written in 1913. And is set in 1913, when homosexuality was still illegal, as it was in the Regency Georgian period in Gentleman's Guide, because it was legal for a really, really long time. People were kind of willing to look the other way a little bit, depending, unless they had some kind of ulterior political motivation to come after you, if you wanted to very, very, very discreetly do things behind closed doors with maybe somebody of your class, which Morris does. He does have a relationship with another man of his own class that ultimately is, very closeted and emotionally unfulfilling for him, and then falls in love with someone else who is, again, just not someone he can be in love with. But what makes Morris kind of extraordinary, and it's something that I think people really do love about Gentleman's Guide as a piece of historical fiction, is that this, which wasn't historical fiction when it was written, it's written in 1913, it's set in 1913. To us, it feels very historical, it feels very Merchant Ivory, it's an E.M. Forster novel, is that this has a happy ending, right? Right, that this is that everything that we think we understand about, you know, historical homophobia dictates that there can be no happy stories for queer people living prior to 2015. Like, that there just can't be, right? But this has a happy ending. And it was an ending that Forster refused to budge on. People told him that you really need to change the ending of this novel, or like no one is gonna buy it or publish it. And he absolutely refused. And incidentally, it was written in 1913. It was not published until 1971. So that really kind of gives you a sense of just what a lack of space there was for anything other than explicit condemnation and tragedy for queer people and queer characters in the 1910s, that this was not published until many decades later. So if you're looking for a historical queer read, or a piece of queer literary history, or a queer classic that isn't going to just be a total knockdown drag, this one is really good. Alright, so my very last recommendation for this video is, but if you do like The Bone Houses by Emily Lloyd-Jones, then you will like The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Which again, now this is one where Emily Lloyd-Jones has spoken specifically about the ways in which The Chronicles of Prydain had an influence on The Bone Houses. The Bone Houses was a very recent Owl Crate book, and it is the rare high fantasy novel that I actually enjoyed. I really liked this book very, very much. It is about a young woman whose family makes a living of it. They're grave diggers, and there is this kind of fantastical thing happening where the dead keep coming back and attacking this village. And so she and this young man embark on a journey together to try to find the source of the bone houses, or the zombies, like, you know, like what can be done about the bone houses. And she's sort of hoping also that she might find her absent father, who has since disappeared. In fact, the reason why The Chronicles of Prydain had such an influence on this, and the reason why I recommend The Chronicles of Prydain if you liked this, is that both of them are based on Welsh mythology. Very, very, not, I won't even say heavily, just like flagrantly, like that, like they make references to like Onwin and things like that. So it's just explicitly Welsh fantasy, which is maybe why I did enjoy this more than a prototypical high fantasy novel. I don't like high fantasy, I just never have. This feels almost like that it is set in our world. This feels like it's just set in like a medieval Wales, where it's like, oh, all the gods are real. Onwin is real. And the gods are real. I mean, I dig that kind of thing. I always really like that kind of fantasy. And that's kind of how this feels to me a little bit. That it's like, what if Welsh mythology is just all true? And I'm like, you got me. I'm here. The Chronicles of Prydain, if you're not familiar, is a very canonical fantasy series that was published in the mid-20th century by Lloyd Alexander. It is also extremely influenced by Welsh mythology, which I just dig. I really like it when fantasy doesn't just replicate, you know, the same, you know, schools of theology and mythology. I really like it when they mix it up a little bit, and it's not just like, it's medieval England. I'll take medieval Wales, thank you. I think that is a lot more interesting. And again, medieval Wales has such a rich tradition. Medieval Wales, just Wales, has such a rich tradition of, you know, fairy stories and fantasy and such a rich mythology. If you are familiar with the Chronicles of Prydain, or are but don't realize that you are, I think it's probably because of Disney's The Black Cauldron, which was a not so great adaptation of the Chronicles of Prydain. I have a lot of fondness in my heart for that movie. I always love when Disney tried to experiment or think outside the box a little bit of their typical formula, and The Black Cauldron is an example for that. And it's an example where it didn't pay off for them, mostly because there was too much studio interference. You wouldn't just let the artists just be dark, and just like, you should have just let them be dark, because the parts of the movie that are dark are so good. Just the Horned King is such a great villain. Anyway, now I'm going on a rant about The Black Cauldron. If you enjoyed The Bone Houses and want to check out, you know, some fantasy that is not just based on like medieval England, but maybe is venturing into other areas of the British Isles that are maybe underrepresented and Wales is always sort of underrepresented in discussions of Great Britain, wrongfully, then I highly recommend both The Bone Houses and The Chronicles of Prydain. Alright, so that is it for all my recommendations. This is something I would maybe like to do again. I really had fun making this one and talking about all these little pairings. I have about 1,000 more I could make, but God knows I don't want to bore all of you with my tedious rambling. So again, I'll kind of play it by ear. So if I don't upload again before the holidays, you know, have a happy holidays. I don't know if I'm going to be able to, just because Christmas becomes so hectic. I'm going to be staying at my parents' house instead of, you know, here for like a month. I'll be there, and it's kind of hard to film when I'm there, and also it's Christmas, so things are so busy. But anyway, if I don't upload again until the new year, have a happy holidays. See you later. Bye.